All right, hi everyone. So, thank you to the sponsors. I know not many people have done that. Thank you to the sponsors of the conference. My name's Andy. I'm here to talk a little bit about an exercise which we did about 2 months ago, where I work, and it was around organising teams and getting teams to select into their operating model. Talk a little about what we did, what we learned, and how we went through that process. So first up, I guess, want to talk a little bit about why we did it. So over the last 6 months or so, we've been moving in our organisation from component-based teams, so teams who are really focused around particular bits of technology, and moving into full-feature cross-functional teams. So we strongly believe that having those cross-functional, stable teams is a real key to success. We'd actually been through a couple of rounds of trying to set those teams up. So back in, I think, December, we went around our first time of trying to set up those teams. We had a bunch of team leads in a room, and they moved people around on post-it notes and said this person should go there, and that person should go there, and these guys should be doing that, and they should be doing that. We then went into a delivery cycle with those teams, and what we found was pretty rapidly that those teams started to kind of float back to their old identities. And there were a lot of different reasons for that, but we think that really one of those was really about how those teams came to be and their identity that they didn't have. So we did another exercise. We kind of did the same thing again. And I sat there and I felt I'm really uncomfortable with this. Like actually putting people around in boxes and saying and designing people's futures for them didn't really sit well with me. So around about the same time, I was introduced to an article by Sandy Mamoli, who's an agile coach working over in New Zealand with a company called TradeMe. And they talked a lot about Squadification. And Squadification was an exercise which they'd done, and it was very inspiring for me. But when I first read that article, I was pretty skeptical, I guess, that it could ever really happen in our organisation. I thought, well, that sounds great. It sounds really cool, but you know, it's pretty out there. I'm not sure we're going to be able to get buy-in for this. So when we came around to our next planning cycle and we needed to revamp all of the teams and actually move into feature teams, the idea kind of rose its head again, and we thought, actually, maybe this is something which could work. Maybe we could give it a go and see what happens, which is what we did. What we found was that it took a lot of time to get there. The actual event which we did, we called it a team fair. It was a one-day event, or probably about half a day, to get everyone in a room and figure out which teams they want to be in. So it should be a pretty short process. It actually took about 3 to 4 weeks, really, of very, very in-depth planning with a lot of people to get to that point. So when I first raised this with the leadership team, I said, let's give this a go, have a look at the article, see what you think. And everyone was kind of a bit, well, probably the same reaction as I was, which is, it sounds interesting, but are you serious? I mean, there's what could happen? You know, what happens if we only need 4 testers in the teams and we've got 9 of them? And what happens then? Do we kind of get rid of some of them? Or so we had to be very clear about what the ground rules for this were. It's not a game of musical chairs. It's probably the first thing. So when the music stops, there is a chair for everyone. We went to each of our teams and we said, you know, this is what we're going to do. Give us your feedback. What are your hopes? What are your fears? What do you think is going to happen? And then that was our starting point to then really start to knock down what are the obstacles to us doing this and what are the things we really need to consider as we go through this process. And one thing which was really important to us while we went through that process is that the people were really the key part of it. And as we went through that process, the one thing we had to really keep in mind was how would our people react and how would this impact our people. So there was a lot of preparation which we had to do. It was probably about, as I say, 3 or 4 weeks of workshops which we did. So on the day, after 3 or 4 weeks of this, and we kind of took it down to the wire, to be honest. We had down to probably the last couple of days where we were still kind of having people saying, you know, are you really sure? But it was absolutely vital that we got everyone on board, because we knew that if we didn't have complete buy-in from everyone, and that's not just the delivery teams, that's from product, that's from senior management, that this was the right thing to do, it could all start to undermine it, and that would unpick it. So on the day itself, there was a lot of work, I guess, also in setting up the room. So there was a session earlier today about facilitation and spending a lot of time before a meeting to get the right kind of things in the room. We found that really, really important, getting the right materials. Each of the teams had a sheet of paper which they had around the room in their particular area, which was all about their team and who they were going to be. And we tried to get everyone into the right mindset, make sure that they've got the right feeling of what this is about. It's about doing what's best for the organisation. And then each team put a little pitch about themselves. So one of the teams actually, they got their team members to come up with what are the skills which they have within their team. So we had some people who can speak Indonesian, people who can play guitar, even somebody who can speak Kiwi, which was a pretty impressive skill. So once we'd got everyone together, we got everyone together first of all, we set the stage, we said, what are we going to do today? This is what it's about. Set down those ground rules again, so make sure you think about what's best for the organisation. This is a game, this is, you know, it's not a game, it's actually a real exercise that we're doing, but also that it was something which we would refine as we went along, and we were very open about the fact that this was, you know, an attempt and something which we would try. And we wanted people to partake. So we got the teams together. We got each of the iteration managers and the product owners to start pitching their team. So each of those teams, we gave them an identity based on a colour, and we knew that they would then start to form their own names beyond that, but we wanted to give them some kind of way of identifying themselves. So what was important is that at this point, we didn't know what features these teams were going to be doing in the future. So this was both an advantage and a disadvantage for us. I guess the advantage was that it didn't end up with everyone just gravitating towards what would be the cool features and, hey, I want to really work on that bit, so that's where I'm going to go. What it did mean is that there was very little way to differentiate between different teams. So if you've got 3 teams of a particular type, how do you know which one you want to go to? And it made it really important that that kernel of the team, the iteration manager and the product owner, were really tightly coupled to start with, really closely aligned on what their team was going to be about. So I think one of our teams were very clear on saying, you know, we're really about continuous improvement. We're really about actually using technology to do things better. And they pitched that in front of everyone, saying these are the values that we stand for. So we had those guys do their pitches in front of everyone. Everyone then dispersed. Everyone had a little avatar. On my first slide, you saw the photos there. So everyone had their identity plus photo printed off, some of which probably looked a bit like convicts, but that's what we could do. And then we sent everyone off, and we said, now go and find your teams. So what happened then was actually, for me, the most interesting part. I was not really sure what to expect. If you say to everyone, OK, off you go and find your teams, you know, I was kind of expecting maybe a bit of a panicked silence and a bit of, you know, people just going, well, what do I do next? There was actually a fantastic energy in the room. So everyone, there were lots and lots of conversations happening. There were lots and lots of people talking in groups which they didn't normally talk in. And we were a little bit worried, I guess, that you just end up with the same teams who had worked before, who would just kind of follow each other around and wouldn't necessarily split apart. But there were actually a lot of surprising choices where people who had gone from being, say, an Android developer and said, actually, I actually want to be a back-end developer, and I'd really like to try this thing. And it's the kind of thing which, had we sat in a room as a bunch of team leads and said, well, that guy should go and start doing back-end development because he'd be really good at that, it probably wouldn't have happened, because those people haven't spoken up and said that. So for me, that's a real vindication of taking this approach, is that those people know what their skills, their desires are, and they can move to where they can be best used. So we did one iteration of this. It took about 10 minutes, and by the end of 10 minutes, pretty much everyone had found themselves a home. They'd stuck up their photo with their team. So they then, each of the teams then played back to the group about how they'd gone. So we asked each of the teams to visualize their team and how they were doing. We'd put together a paper for everyone. One team used this kind of layout of a red, green, and amber. So for particular skills, whether they were covered for that or not. And what was really important is that we had not actually said, we need 2 testers per team, or we need 4 developers per team, or we need 1 Android person and 1 iOS person. We just said, there's 2 rules really for the team. 1, 7 plus or minus 2, so it can't be larger than 9. And you've got to have coverage of all the skills that you need to do your job. So if you need coverage of iOS, if you need coverage of Android dev, you've got to have somebody who can do that. They may not be a full-time iOS developer today, but somebody who's got experience of that, so you've got coverage. Or the team thinks that between them, they can cover that off. So those are the only 2 rules for those teams. So everyone played back. How were they doing? After the first iteration, we were probably about 80% there, I'd say. We had a couple of teams who were oversubscribed. We had one team which was probably drastically undersubscribed in numbers and in terms of its skill coverage. So what we did was we went into a second iteration and we said to people, let's go again. Let's try once again and see where we get to. So we had a bit of movement in the second iteration. We had some people who had said, okay, well, I realise the team I'm in's got too many people and I could be used over there. So I'll go and talk to those guys and see what they're doing. So we had a fair bit of movement. Did another 10 minutes. We found that after our second iteration, we'd probably cleared up a couple of the oversubscribed teams, but we still had some left. Still one team which I think had 11 people, where they only could have 9. But we'd certainly solved some of the undersubscribed teams. So that was a good outcome. Third iteration. We actually had a lunch break there, and we came back for the third iteration. And from the conversations which had happened during the second iteration, we knew we had a couple of just fairly immovable problems which weren't getting anywhere. So we said, we'll break the mold a bit. We'll try something, do a bit of a longer iteration, maybe get some people out, do some breakout sessions, and try and facilitate an outcome with some of those teams. So after about another 45 minutes, we hadn't actually changed at all. So iteration 2 to iteration 3, exactly the same. So at that point, we made a decision. We said, okay, this is not going to go anywhere now. What are we going to do? So we actually went to the teams and we said, bit of an ultimatum. We'll give you another 5 minutes. You can solve these problems. If you don't solve them, we'll take it offline. That'll be it, and we'll just kind of close off the day. There's no point kind of keeping people here. We'll take it offline and we'll just solve it as a management team, and we'll kind of go back to the old way of solving those problems. That actually did solve one of those problems by the end of that 5 minutes, and we still had a couple of other teams where there were still some discrepancies in the coverage which they needed. So we just said we'll take those offline and we'll sort those out. But I would suggest we're probably kind of at that point 90 to 95% complete in what we needed. So I think generally that was a pretty good outcome for us. So what did we learn? Well, I learned that, as we'd expected, I guess people will move in groups. So there were certain people who had particular friendships or relationships which they wanted to maintain. But also that when people were given the space and given the impetus to really focus on what's best for the business, that they would actually take some risks and try things which they hadn't tried before. We had some teams actually who had a particular skill which they wanted to cover. They didn't have the person who was from that skill in their team, but they said, actually, as a group between 3 or 4 of us, we think we've got enough to learn this and to cover it, and we're okay to handle that. So the resiliency of teams when they didn't have the necessary skilled person to do it, but to pick it up was a really important thing which we appreciated. Having strong preparation and strong admin support was actually really, really important as well. We actually did have a little bit of a hiccup on the morning. We'd printed out all the photos from people's identity cards and said, okay, we'll put them all on a table. People can pick up their photos and they'll come in. We thought that was great. About 30 minutes before people came in, somebody had the idea of checking off to make sure we had everybody's photo. We didn't. So a little bit of panic, because obviously that probably wouldn't be a great look to somebody to if they turn up and they're not on the list anymore. All those who don't have a photo. No. We did dodge that one. We had a photographer lined up and we got those photos printed off in time. But it goes to show that, particularly this was like 70 to 100 people. If you've got that many people, you've got to be pretty clear that you know everyone who's in there and you're not missing people off. Also, I think what was a really big benefit was having those IMs and product owners tied up from the start and having them as a real kernel of the team, and giving that team an identity was really, really important. We actually spent quite a bit of time trying to pair up those iteration managers and product owners. That in itself was a whole exercise, which was required a lot of bravery from those people because they had to put themselves out there and choose each other and do a bit of a speed date. That was a fairly confronting experience for them, but it really cemented those relationships, which meant that those teams had that kernel. So overall, I think the event went very, very well, and we had a lot of positive feedback from those people who were involved in it. A lot of excitement from people at the end of it that they wanted to get on with getting into those teams. We're now about 8 weeks on from that. We've been doing a transition period, so we've had those teams meeting regularly, at least every week, to start to form, to bring their identity. They've given themselves names. They've been talking about how they're going to work. And we're on the verge in the next couple of weeks of actually spinning those teams up. I think my lessons from the last 8 weeks or so of that have been, once people have done this self-selection exercise, they're really keen to get into those teams. So in hindsight, I think 8 weeks is probably too long. If we could have shortened it some way, that would have been better. I think also the thing is that you take a certain point in time, things change. So people do move on. For whatever reason, there may be changes in your staffing during that period. And each time that happens, there's always a temptation to then kind of fall back into the old mode and say, well, okay, we've now got a gap over here. Maybe we should move that person over there. And you suddenly catch yourself going, hang on, that's completely opposite to what we were just doing, and that we're undoing the work which we've just done. So that was a real kind of a lesson for us, I think, was getting that up much more quickly would have, I think, been more effective. So I think when it comes to results, look, the real result will be once we actually get those teams really working and humming, and we actually get output from them. So at this point, I'll put my hands up. I can't tell you a success story yet. I'm hoping that I can come back in a year and have a fantastic success story. But all the positive indicators, I think, are there from how those teams have started to form. And I'm very confident that what we've done is the right way forward for the business. And certainly it was a very good learning exercise for everyone who was involved. And I think it's something which, given the chance, I would certainly do again, and I would recommend to other people to do. If you are interested in doing it and you want to know more, I'd definitely suggest reading the article which Sandy originally published. If you take a look at nomad8.com, you will see her article there. And that's from TradeMe. There's also a self-selection kit which Sandy has published, which has kind of all the materials which they used for their exercise when they did this. And also a link there, I've written, I guess, a slightly more detailed version of this talk on my blog as well, talking about that. So that's pretty much our story, I guess, and what we did. If there's any questions, I'm happy to answer.
And did you find people are choosing like-minded people, or are they really choosing teams based on different goals?
I think there's a bit of both. So there were definitely people where we'd had two like-minded people who had worked in different teams, who suddenly saw the opportunity to say, wow, fantastic, we should start working together and I mean, that's great, right? I mean, you want people who will work well together and can gel, not at the expense of the rest of the team, but certainly if you get a kernel of people who can work together. But I think no, there was a real sense that people were doing what was best for the organisation. I mean, one of those cases in the first iteration where somebody had moved away from the team that they were in and had left a gap, and because they wanted to move into another team. In the second iteration, nobody told them to go back to the team they were in, but they saw that there was a gap there. They saw that they were able to fill that gap, and so they moved back of their own accord. So there was definitely a real sense that people were doing what was best for the organisation.
You said you removed the products out from those teams. You just assigned them a colour as an identity. How do you then go about reassigning those teams back against the products where you've now got your knowledge dispersed amongst 6 teams?
So we've split them up into 2 types of teams based on the kind of different skill profiles, I guess, that we need. So some are more kind of front-end facing and some are more kind of back-end facing, I guess, for a loose characterization. And then part of what we're doing now as we move into our next work stream is we've got a bunch of features that we want to play and starting to flow those features into the teams. So we were very clear that we wanted long-lived teams and that the work would move to the teams. The actual process of moving the work into the teams, there's a bit of negotiation, there's a bit of stories, feature slicing which needs to happen sometimes. So we know that quite often, well, most of our features will have differing aspects to them, both front and back end. So intelligently slicing those features so they can be delivered is part of it. But yeah, that's certainly, there's a bit of an art to it, I guess, which we're still, I think, figuring out ourselves.
Did you determine who the team leaders were going to be, or were they did they determine that internally as they formed those teams?
So we'd, as it was, we had probably 2 or 3 iteration managers already. So they were going to carry on in those roles, and we did go and find some others, I guess, and that was part of those 3 weeks. We actually had to kind of find a couple of other iteration managers, and same for product owners as well. So we did assign those. We didn't pull those out of the teams. Certainly, the main difference between what we did and what TradeMe did in our original kind of inspirational piece was that they just had product owners. So they had, I think, 4 or 5 product owners, and then everyone gravitated around the product owner. We actually set up the product owner and IM pairs initially to go into that.
So you had to define a number of teams that were going to exist.
Yeah, so we knew we wanted 5 teams, and we'd done some kind of basic maths, I guess, to check that the number of people we had divided by 5 was about right, and we weren't going to end up with lots of excess.
Not product owners, not VAs.
Exactly, yeah.
Sorry, just to carry on, is there a formal transfer if someone wanted to move from one team to another? Or how does, like you said, someone just went back to another team?
So during the process, during the actual team fair, it was just fluid, so people moved. Beyond that, we have had some moves, and what we've done is we've said to the people, speak to the IM of the team you're with, speak to the IM of the team you're going to, and between the 3 of you, you can work out if that's the right thing or not. But I don't want to be the one kind of saying, yes, you can move, and my leadership team don't want to either.
So if you have someone go from a team, what are your thoughts on how that team's going to fill that spot? What about how you would do that?
Absolutely, we're living it right now, and that's actually one of the things, right? With being financial year end, being the kind of place where there's a number of I guess contractors on the books, we've had different movements, and at one point we actually said, we've got this many teams, do we actually need to get rid of a team and completely reshuffle everything? We didn't, which I'm really glad about, because I think that would have been quite heartbreaking given all the effort we've done. But yeah, where we've got particular skills, so if somebody is we've still got a lot of places where there's the single person who's got a skill, then we've tried to cover that within the team if possible. Where we've found that we're at 9 teams. If they get down to 9 people in a team. If they get down to 7 people in a team, it's actually not a bad outcome. It's probably okay, and probably most of the teams we had were rather on the large side, and so if they shrink a little bit, that's probably not too bad.
So how are you addressing delivering product while you're doing this transition? Is it all gradual?
No, so the transition period has been while we're delivering, so everyone's been in their pre-existing teams delivering, and the aim of that was that they can finish off the program of work they were on. There's never a clean endpoint, of course. There's always some kind of hangover, but that we were able to do that at the same time as starting to get the teams up and running, get them to figure out what they need to do. If they've got particular areas of coverage which they're missing, how are they going to cover those off? So we've been carrying on doing delivery at the same time. Yeah.
To add to that, there's actually an important point. All our teams are actually like tightly co-located. So even though we're doing a transition now to these cross-functional teams, for a short period there, the work's going to follow the individuals until that specific piece of work is done, and then the teams will just wholeheartedly pull it up.
Yeah.
2 questions. Have you had anyone who was totally disenfranchised by the whole process and left because of that? The other one, just from our environment, how different are the technical skills required such that certain people just couldn't fill another role, like from a program perspective, different capabilities?
We haven't had anyone leave directly through the way we did the team selection. Certainly not that I'm aware of. Certainly not that they've said. It's also been a change in the way we've operated all of our teams, which has had knock-on impacts as well. But for the selection kind of process itself, no. In terms of skills, look, we have had certain areas where there's just one person who knows it, and if I give an example, performance testing for us has been just one person who does it, and now all the teams need to understand it to some way. So we've really kind of battled with how do we, does that person kind of sit across all the teams, or do we need to grow that? What we've ended up doing is saying that we need to incubate that within each of the teams, and there's going to be one person who's going to help us do that through that process. But yeah, it's absolutely. that where we are at the moment, we've got those single points of failure, and we know that we've got islands of knowledge, and we're trying to break that. And this is part of doing it. And there's pain as you go through that process. I'll take 2 more questions, and then.
Andy, how did the staff react to it? Did they find it a positive experience? I know if it was me, I'd be pretty bloody nervous.
I don't know. I think there were a lot of nerves. There were definitely a lot of nerves before. I think during the actual event itself, certainly from my read on it, I kind of floated around the room and saw what people are doing. There was a real positive energy about it, actually. In most cases, people were very engaged by it. They enjoyed the process. I think absolutely before there were definitely nerves about, what if my skills don't fit, or what if there isn't a place for me. But I think once we gave people the ground rules about how it was going to operate, and that there's always a place for everyone, that they got that and they ran with it.